Chapter 3. The sun shone down gently and pleasantly on Quantico Marine Base, Virginia. It wasn't often these days that you got sun, not with some of the clouds that still hung in the atmosphere, not with the strange weather since the invasion. Colonel Leon Marshall had his drapes flung wide to let the warmth into his office. He sat at his desk now, the report printout neatly encased in clear mylar before him. He glanced over the neatly listed facts and figures and smiled to himself, feeling a pleasant rush of anticipation. Amazing. Absolutely astonishing. Puissance to the formerly powerless, power to the formerly impotent, is heady stuff indeed. And the close-cropped, burly colonel was feeling positively giddy with the prospects that lay before him. The digital clock on his desk turned silently to 11 a.m. The general was a prompt man. He'd be here any moment. Colonel Leon Marshall had been preparing his demonstration since 700 hours this morning, and all was ready to go. Now he could afford to take a quick breather, relax, and enjoy the prospects that lay before him, his career, and, of course, the future of this battered country in its efforts to build a strong defense, even as it rebuilt its cities and its economy. The digital clock was just threatening to transmute to another number when his intercom chimed softly, and the adenoidal voice of his secretary swept through. "Colonel, General Burroughs is here." "Excellent." Colonel Marshall slapped his desk and its thin burden lightly and stood up. "Send him in." The door cycled open with a whir, and the burly figure of General Delmore Burroughs marched in, his eyes turreting like offensive guns on a land carrier. They sighted on Marshall, and a flicker of camaraderie shone in them below the grim and businesslike exterior. "Leon?" Pudgy fingers were extended. The general's grip was certain and firm. "General Burroughs, thank you so much for coming. I believe the words urgent and maximum importance were used in your communication, Colonel. I tend to respond to those words, but I am a busy man." The eyes turned stony. "I hope that my time here is not misspent." General Delmore Burroughs was a beefy black man with a bald pate rising up from greyed temples. He had a broad nose and a voice deep and full. He smelled strongly of bay rum and the instastarch of his uniform. He was a general who had gotten to where he'd gotten by taking no shit, and Marshall respected that. If he was a person who trifled with such things as mottos, then this general's motto would have been, "The ends justify the means." That was why Colonel Marshall needed to get him in on this project. "I'm not a man to waste time, you know that," said Marshall. "Tell you what, you think it's a waste of time, you get to use my ski chalet in Vermont for a weekend, complete with my little black book." The general's eyes glimmered a bit. A hint of a smile played on his lips. Then his teeth clamped down. His face assumed its normal grim posture. "Fair enough." "Good. Then lean back, drink some Kona, and have a cigar. This will take a couple of minutes, and I might as well kiss your butt a while as well." The general couldn't help but chuckle. "Cigars? Where are you getting cigars, Colonel?" He sat down. Marshall stuck a cup of steaming Java beside the general's elbow. Then he pulled out a humidor from one of the drawers. Smith E. Ortega's. "They're just swinging into production again, and my sources dug up the best of the first batch." The general rolled it, sniffing. You know, soldier, it's been so long since I've had one of these. This just might kill me with the pleasure. He chuckled and took up the clipper that Marshall offered, dealt with the cigar end in an almost reverent fashion. Now, what exactly have you got on that scheming mind of yours? He stuck the cigar in his mouth and allowed Marshall to play a flame over the end. He puffed, blew out bluish smoke. His eyes seemed to roll back with the pleasure. General, do you recall that unfortunate incident last week with the Iowa boy at the Goodwill Games? Sure. Put the world record in the American camp firmly, probably for years to come. Puff, spume. Too bad about the accident. General, did you know that drugs were involved? Nonsense. Good American talent and muscle pulled that boy over the line. You didn't read the results of the autopsy. Oriander had xenozip in his blood. Xenozip? Fire. What, that silly pick-me-up they're putting in the stores now? Marshall, he probably had caffeine and lots of good old-fashioned testosterone too. Ain't nothing that great about those pills. Hell, I tried a couple. Goosed me a bit is all, but with no crash and burn. Nothing that would make me win a race. That's exactly what everyone says, but I did a quick search of news cuts for the last couple of months. And then I had the boys at Biochem do some quick testing. Came up with some remarkable findings. He gave the general a moment to exhale his last puff of smoke. Then he tendered the plastic-enclosed paper to the man. General Burroughs grunted. He murmured a whiff of annoyance, and then dug into a side pocket for a pair of half-frame spectacles, which he put on. His eyes strafed the paper for several moments, then he shrugged and handed it back to Marshall. I've got a team of science boys to read this stuff for me and digest it. I don't get much out of it on my own, I'm afraid. That's all right, General. I had to have most of it explained to me. Just a few items of jargon, some facts and figures to illustrate the fact that I've done some serious work on this. Right, Colonel. I believe you. But I still don't see where you're coming from. The general tapped off some ash from the cigar, then left the smoking thing sitting in the tray. He folded his arms, a sure sign of impatience. Time to cut to the chase. You're aware of the active ingredient of fire, aren't you, General? Sure. The PR is that it's alien royal jelly. Actually, there's more to it than that. It's alien royal jelly with a drop or two of Queen Mother extra royal jelly. All that comes from one source, the Queen Mother, who got nuked. Can't get it anywhere else. A minuscule amount of this mixture acts in a positive, boosting fashion on the human nervous system. The cigar remained in the tray. It went out. The general ignored it. Correct. However, even with a minuscule amount, Neopharm, the manufacturer, found itself running out of the regular jelly. They started manufacturing synthesized stuff, with mixed results. It still needs a few molecules of Queen Mother royal jelly to work, though. The general grinned. Right. I'm not surprised they're running out of jelly. We blew most of the bug bastards straight to hell. Absolutely, and we did a fine job of it too, and a better job of reconstructing. But that leaves us, as the military, in a bit of a quandary, doesn't it? And I don't have to give you a sheet of facts and figures to prove it. The enemy is mostly defeated. All the governmental money is pouring into rebuilding or into outer space. Now that the military's done its job, it's the same old story. No respect. We get squat in the way of money to develop what we have to develop to stay modern. The grey eyes sparked with anger. It was a sore subject with all career military sorts. The general had taken the bait. Now all Marshall had to do was to reel him in. Public sentiment is also very anti-war machine. I think it's a historical distrust of power. The media tends to think that if the military has too many resources in a time of peace, they may get antsy and take over the government. So the other extreme occurs. The military gets weak. And so, when the country needs us, we get thrown into the fray unprepared, and we get clobbered. That's provable history, General. The general nodded, anger etched into his face. He picked up the cigar, stuck it into his mouth. Marshall happily relit it for him. What can we do about it? We're not getting the funds to build new and improved equipment. So, why not build a new and improved soldier? General Burrows squinted suspiciously. What? Synthetics? Cybernetic? DNA jobs? That costs a pretty cred too, Marshall. The old boy wasn't following the line of reasoning. That was one thing about Burrows. He was a little thick sometimes, a little bullish. But like a bull, if you pointed him in the right direction, all you had to do was grab the tail and he'd take you where you wanted to go. That was why Marshall had cooked up his little exhibition. In show and tell, the show carried the greatest weight. Marshall smiled. How about if you could do it for just a few bucks a head, General? General Burrows barked a growly laugh. Pull the other one, Colonel. He pushed out a stream of smoke and palpable disbelief. Marshall checked his wrist chronometer. The players in the game would be just about ready. General, if you'd care to step out on my balcony, there's a little demonstration I'd very much like to show you, courtesy of some of the men in my company. Burrows shrugged. I'm here. I've smoked your cigar. I've listened to your curious nonsense. And I must say, you have used some of the government money I'm responsible for to throw together this bit of research. So I guess you put me in a position where I don't have much of a choice in the matter. He took out the smoking cigar and pointed it gruffly towards the Colonel's nose. But let me tell you, Colonel, I'd better see some serious justification for the use of this taxpayers' money. Naturally, sir. Marshall got up and marched over to a side wall, hung tastefully with mementos, weapons, and equipment. He pulled out 2 pairs of electronically enhanced binoculars from rechargers and handed one to the general. Then he pointed towards the sliding glass doors and the open spaces beyond. Come on, General. Wait till you get a gander at this. The balcony was actually an extension of a catwalk and stairs system that connected a number of buildings in the newly built assembly of offices, barracks, and warehouses that comprised this portion of Quantico. Beyond, a bank of obsidian-bottomed clouds hung on the horizon. A storm was brewing. Nothing unusual on Earth now, storms. Marshall shivered a bit at the prospect. They moved fast, those storms. Dark battalions of weather, phantom marchers left behind after the war. but there would be time for the exhibition. Marshall picked up a walkie-talkie from the desk. The two officers walked to the edge of the balcony. Marshall leaned against the railing and pointed down at the open yard below. Some yards away, a group of enlisted men seemed to be milling about, up to nothing much more than loitering. The general glowered. "Looks like a bunch of men goofing off." "If you'll just direct your binocs towards that lone private over there in the corner, sir." General Burrows harumphed, but he angled the cigar off to one side of his mouth and put the binoculars up, finger expertly adjusting the focusing vernier. "Looks like just a normal grunt, and a mighty doofy one, come to think of it." Marshall brought up his glasses and took a look. Yes, there he was, the poor guy, looking a little lost and oblivious as usual. Gawky, geeky, big Adam's apple, tiny brain. Colonel Marshall was a collector of mid-20th century cultural remnants, and he remembered one of Edgar Bergen's puppets. That was who the guy reminded him of. Mortimer snurred. "That's Private Willie Pinnock, and if I may say so, your assessment is right on the money. Private Pinnock barely made it through boot camp. His reflexes are slow, his IQ is low. He can barely handle latrine and KP duties, but he can, which is why he isn't booted." "So what's so special about this particular private?" "Just a moment. You'll see." Marshall opened up the walkie-talkie he'd taken with him. "Corporal Glenn, can you read me?" The walkie-talkie sputtered and spat back. "Roger, I read you, Colonel." Marshall pointed to where the corporal was standing on a crate, snapped to attention, waving at them. "Our referee, if you will, General." He clicked the channel back on. "Corporal, you may proceed with the exhibition." "Yes, sir," spat the walkie-talkie. Up went the binoculars. Corporal Glenn, a well-built specimen who looked good even in fatigues, semaphored to the private off to one side of the courtyard. However, Pinnock did not respond. Glenn signalled again. Nothing. General Burrows arched an eyebrow. "Cripes," thought Marshall. "This had better come off, or my butt is cooked." "What's wrong with that soldier?" he barked into the walkie-talkie. "Off in a little world of his own, sir." "Well, drag him out of it and let's get the show on the road. The general hasn't got all day." Glenn yes-sirred, then trotted quickly off to where Private Pinnock stood, spinning rainbows. He tapped the nerd on the shoulder, flapped his gums in traditional Mad Army drill instructor fashion, and Marshall didn't need binoculars to see Pinnock jump, flinch, and generally cringe at the chewing out. A bob of head from the private, and then Glenn trotted back to his monitoring duty. Pinnock's shoulders were slumped. He looked quite hesitant and more than a little frightened at the prospect before him. Nonetheless, he slipped his hand into his pocket of his fatigues and drew something out. "Get a close-up on what he has in his hands, sir," suggested Marshall. "A bottle of that drug, Xenozip." "Yes, sir, that's right." Pinnock visibly drew a deep breath. He turned towards a wall as though he were doing something shameful, and then dragged a shaky hand through his blonde, short-cropped hair. He opened up the bottle of fire, pouring out 3 tablets, then choked them down without the benefit of water. He stiffened and visibly shuddered. "Doesn't look like he's having much fun, Colonel." "No, sir. May I give you a brief personality profile. Pinnock is a meek fellow with a minimal aggression quotient. His adrenaline levels are low. He doesn't get mad when the other soldiers tease him. They generally just put up with him, since he tends to do the distasteful chores for them. With no resentment? None that is reported. Marshall looked at his chronometer. The increased dosage in the subject was his order, to increase the speed of release of the chemicals into the bloodstream. The last thing he needed was an impatient general. The results were going to have to be fairly immediate, or Burroughs would just about face and leave. A minute since ingestion. That would be about right. Glenn, next step. Yes, sir, snapped the walkie-talkie. The colonel signaled the milling group of men. They loosely ordered themselves and began marching towards the lone private, like a gaggle of surly teamsters heading for a manager. They were bulky lads, with rock muscles earned by constant drilling and exercises. Marshall could hear a couple of them joking with one another. They had no weapons, only their fists. Marshall had planned it that way. He didn't want to see Pinnock or anyone else get hurt. Exactly. Scuffed up a bit, that was all. A little red on the turf was always a dramatic underline. Besides, these barracks bullies might be in for a little something they hadn't bargained for. The frontmost of the group, a beefy tower of a man, stepped up to Pinnock, grabbed him by the shoulder and spun him around. A few obscene motions and words were made. Pinnock did nothing. Another man stepped forward and shoved the private. Pinnock shuffled backward, still not reacting. Not even cringing, which was a good sign. Then another grunt snuck up behind him and got down on all fours. Big Pecs stepped forward, executed a sharp, swift push. Pinnock tumbled onto the ground. The smallest of the men, a little guy with a rat face, stepped in and gave a sneaky kick to the private's backside. "What the hell is going on?" said the general. "This is absurd." Marshall tensed. There should be some reaction here by now. Was all this going to be a ridiculous fiasco? The ratty-faced man sneered and went in for another free kick. However, this time he did not step back after the blow was delivered, and the sneer melted into a look of alarm. Something snapped. There was a scream, and Rat-Face was flung ass over elbow backward. He was slammed into the corrugated metal of a barracks wall and left a smear of blood as he poured onto the ground. Out for the count. The burly bully boys took a step back. Private Pinnock jumped to his feet. "Holy shit," said General Burroughs. The officers' binoculars leapt to their eyes. Pinnock's eyes seemed to glow. 3 tablets of the synthesized version of fire, said Marshall. He brought up his walkie-talkie. "Okay, Glenn, have the boys subdue the private." The corporal barked out orders. The men stepped forward again, looking quite a bit more tentative now, and probably a damned near sight startled. Still, they were good military men, and they followed orders. They advanced, closing in on Pinnock on all sides. There would be a wonderful tussle, but there were a good 8 tough boys there, and they'd pin the guy down, and then they'd get in the restraining leg cuffs and force jacket, and let Pinnock burn off his sudden energy. We did a genetic workup on the men, and Pinnock proved to be the most susceptible to the effects of the drug. Marshall explained. Of course, No one understands what the hell happens really, or what's likely to. Sometimes it appears to have no effect at all. Pinnock is a most suitable specimen, don't you think, sir? He's outnumbered. But what the hell's happening to him? Said the general. This is remarkable. Up with the binocs, down with the jaw. It wasn't just the man's attitude and spirit that had changed. His whole physique seemed altered. Latent muscles seemed pumped up, and the whole face seemed chiseled purpose and resolve. And those burning eyes. Pinnock grabbed the first of the men and with lightning speed lifted him off his feet and hurled him back, knocking over 5 more army men. Those burning eyes. His face seemed twisted into a mask of hatred and anger. From Mortimer Snerd into Superman. Amazing, said General Burrows, echoing Marshall's thoughts. He had no idea. Pinnock didn't give the others a moment to rally. He charged in, punching and throttling. Gobbets of blood flew into the air, along with shrill shrieks and gurgles. Maybe he shouldn't have used 3 pills. Glenn's voice erupted over the walkie-talkie, but the device was hardly necessary. Marshall could hear him yelling desperately down in the courtyard. "Colonel! Pinnock's getting out of hand!" Pinnock leapt onto the back of Big Pex and grabbed a hold of the man's neck. Big Pex tried to throw him off, but Pinnock was as firmly planted on him as the old man of the sea. The crazed private gripped the head and wrenched, his tendons standing out from his neck. A loud snap and a pulse of arterial blood, and the big man wilted to the ground, his neck broken, his head almost torn from its mooring. The other soldiers had watched this, stunned and stuck in indecision. The bloody demise of their fellow soldier sent them racing away. Pinnock, grinning like a death's head, caught 2 and slammed their skulls together. He raced and tackled another, pummeling him into a pulp with his fists. Perhaps, thought Colonel Marshall, I should not have chosen a soldier with such understandable resentment buried in him. The walkie-talkie spoke again. "Colonel, he's out of control! We need armed soldiers out here! Oh my God!" cried the general. "Behind him!" The crazed berserker that had been a meek private leapt upon the corporal, grabbed the walkie-talkie, and slammed the hard metal and plastic over and over again into the man's face, until it was a bloody mess. Colonel Marshall did not pause long to watch. He was screaming into another radio channel for backup, armed backup. There'd been absolutely no indication that this exhibition would get this far out of control. 2 soldiers, one with a machine gun, one with a blaster, raced into the courtyard. Somehow, in the sudden blur and explosion of fire and bullets, and despite a bullet wound and the loss of part of an arm, Pinnock managed to wrest the machine gun away and use it on the backup soldiers, killing them instantly. Amid the decimation, Colonel Marshall watched with horror as the bleeding and burnt chemically charged maniac slowly swiveled around like a gladiator surveying his kill and seeking out the Emperor. "Christ!" said General Burrows. "He's looking at us!" And not for approval. "General, quickly, back to the office." Even at their first step, a hail of bullets splattered over their heads. Marshall was stung with flying cement chips. Ducking, they lunged through the office doors, and the glass windows exploded. Burrows took cover behind a desk, and Marshall leapt for his wall of weapons. He tore 2 loaded semi-automatic hyper-machine guns from their racks and threw one to the general. "I haven't used one of these in years," moaned Burrows. "Watch!" Marshall clicked off the safety. He ran to the billowing curtains, took cover, and squeezed off a salvo at the approaching maniac. No hits, but he got the feel of the thing. He dodged as another hail of bullets crashed through the door, tearing up a wall of certificates and pictures. Marshall retreated, letting off 2 more burps of fire. There was a moment of silence, and then Pinnock marched in like he was Superman. He gripped the gun, and the grin on his face was like an axe wound. One eye was a bloody gouge, but the other gleamed like diamond. Blood rivuletted down his face. One whole side of his body was burned. He lifted up the machine gun like a crazed zombie with firepower. Burrows had figured out how to use the hyper, and he ripped off a magazine. However, only a couple of bullets hit their mark, the others splattering along a wall. Pinnock was knocked off his feet, falling back into the balcony. But with iron determination and a brain burning with chemicals, he began to get up. Marshall lifted his gun to fire again, but it jammed. He didn't waste time on the weapon, flinging it down and leaping off to a rack. The nearest weapon was a bazooka. He tore it off the wall, grabbed a shell, loaded up, and ducked back behind a chair, just as a new hail of bullets chunked and screamed into the weapon's wall. A pause. Pinnock was out of ammunition. He had to be. Marshall thumbed off the safety, checked the go light of his weapon, thanking the powers that were that he'd kept up on his weapons training. He brought the short barrel of the mini bazooka up and gave himself only a fraction of a second to aim. Private Pinnock, smoking and smelling of burnt flesh, still grinning, walked towards him, death glaring from his one good eye. Marshall squeezed the trigger. The shell whooshed out of its pipe and whacked directly into the maniac private's chest, pushing him back through the door into the balcony before it detonated. The explosion of the shell blasted the private and his gun to pieces, not even leaving smoking boots behind. Marshall gasped and collapsed, dragging ragged breaths into his weary lungs. What a fiasco! A catastrophe of the first order. Support from the general? He'd be lucky now if he didn't get his chops busted, didn't get demoted or sent to deal with some alien infestation in northern Alaska. General Burrows cautiously poked his head from behind the desk. His uniform was torn, and he had a stunned look to his eyes. He regarded the tattered gore, the remnants of Private Pinnock spread over the balcony like an explosion in a butcher's shop. He smiled slowly. "I believe, Colonel, this drug bears some further investigation. But please, not while I'm around."